Good evening and welcome to tonight's Festival of Ideas event, All Mapped Out, How Maps Shape Us. I'm Nick Hicks. I'm an Associate Director at York Health Economics Consortium, which is part of the University of York, and I'm here to present tonight's talk, or to present the presenter of tonight's talk. So just a few housekeeping notes before we start. A few technical notes just to explain how this will work as a Zoom presentation. So subtitles are available in the event. So turn these on or off using the CC Show Captions button at the bottom of your screen. Should you have any technical links, such as a loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link. If you're watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen, and this is available throughout the event, so questions can be posted at any time, and we'll pick them up at the end of Mike's presentation. And please remember that today's event is being recorded, so you will be able to watch again. So I'm delighted to welcome today Dr. Mike Duggan. Mike is a lecturer at King's College, London, studying digital culture's impact on society. He's a co-author of books on radical cartography and sharing mobility. And his latest book, All Mapped Out, How Maps Shape Us, is a fascinating journey through the history of maps, from ancient cave paintings to stone carvings, to today's digital interfaces that we rely on. Mike will reveal more about the people behind these and how maps have affected societies, influenced politics and economies, impacted the environment, and even shaped our sense of personal identity. So enough from me, and over to you, Mike. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick, for a very kind introduction, and thanks everyone for coming. And yeah, sorry to keep you between your dinner and your leadership debate. I'm sure you can go and watch those two battle it out afterwards. Yes, so I'm here really to talk about this book that I published earlier in the year, All Mapped Out. I can't cover all of the topics that I think Nick outlined there, but I'll try my best to cover a few of those. And a few words about the book really to get us started. So the book is an exercise in translation. So thinking about how to translate some academic ideas and discussions and debates about maps to a wider audience. So this is a good opportunity to kind of test that to see if it works or not. And the book is kind of my attempt at translation. You know, all too often academic ideas stay within the remit of the academic journal, the academic monograph. And I think there needs to be a bit more of kind of translating those ideas to a broader public. So let's see how I go. You can be the judge of that. So I want you to have this question in mind as I talk today, which is, what are maps? So on the surface, a very simple question, a very obvious answer to this question. But I want you to have this in your mind, kind of hold it through the conversation I'm going to try and have with you about what are maps, what do they do, what kinds of activities and what kinds of practices do they shape. The book itself, if I can go to my slides, covers a number of different topics ranging from navigation all the way through to how maps influence power, politics, culture, how location data and advanced geospatial technologies, including AI, how these things are changing how and why we use maps and the impacts they have around the world. But for today, I'm just going to focus on three aspects. So it's just a very clear presentation. So I've got three propositions I want to make to you all tonight, and hopefully I can try and convince you of at least one of them, let's say. So I want to argue that maps are not always what they seem, and then I want to talk about how maps are social and cultural objects. So by this I mean they are socially embedded in our everyday lives. They're not just lifeless objects, but they become part of our life worlds. And the third proposition I want to make is that maps shape our perceptions and our politics. And this might be a proposition some of you have come across before, but I'll try and add something a bit new here in terms of how digital mapping technologies are shaping different ways in which we see each other as well as ourselves. Okay, so proposition number one, maps are not always what they seem. So if I asked you to imagine a map or to write me a definition of a map, I think many of you may come up with a definition which looks or is represented by these kinds of images. So this kind of top-down view of the world from above. Sometimes this view is called the view from nowhere. Sometimes it's called the God's eye view. And lots of maps, when we think about maps, are two-dimensional. They are at a certain scale. They're using certain symbols and signs to represent different spaces and places on the landscape in different geographies. And these are just three maps from three different time periods to illustrate that in relation to York. And you would not be wrong in suggesting that these are not maps. I definitely agree with you. These are maps. But what I want to do is try and tease at this idea that this is the only way of thinking about what maps are to get started. So I want to take you to the Yorkshire moors and start by thinking about older or ancient forms of representing spaces and places. So if you think about the job of a map was to represent certain geographies, to represent certain places, there's a long history, before this kind of modern understanding about what maps are, of various different ways that people did this form of representation. And one of the earliest forms that we found in the kind of scientific community is rock carvings from the megalithic period, so the late Bronze Age, Iron Age period. And these are found all over Europe, ranging from southern Europe right the way through to Scotland. This is one at Badgerstone in Ilkley Moor, and these are called ring and cup carvings. So as you can see on the image, there's these rings with cups in the middle, or cups with rings around the outside. And we don't really know what these are for. A bit similar to Stonehenge. We know that they are sites of significance to the cultures and the communities at the time, but we don't know exactly the reasons why these things are made or exactly what they're intended to represent. All we know is that there's some relationship between what is on the rock and the landscape around it. If we go to another part of the moors, this is a astronomic carving, so produced around the same time, but instead of relating to the landscape around it, it's relating to things which are happening in the sky, kind of celestial relationship. And these are two examples of rock carvings around the time, which again were basically made. We don't know the reasons why, but to provide some kind of representation of what was going on around the communities at the time. Now, I would agree, and I'm sure many of you would agree, these are not maps in the sense that we understand maps today. But there are other rock carvings that existed around the same time which do look a bit more like the maps that we know today. A very famous example is the Bedellina petroglyph in northern Italy. There's a site here with 109 rock carvings. It's quite an impressive site, all along the side of this valley. And this rock carving, as you can see, it looks a bit more like the kind of images that come to mind when we think about maps. And the carving's on the top right, and then there's the etching below. And we might get the sense that what we're seeing here is a series of settlements, some roads, maybe some farming plots, some sites of significance. And what I'm doing in the book, and what other scholars in the field are trying to do, is kind of tease away at the idea that this may not be the right approach to thinking about older forms of maps. So the archaeological evidence suggests that actually there's no real evidence to suggest that this is a map at all. There's more evidence to suggest that actually it may be relating to sites of symbolic importance rather than specific sites in the landscape. So these may not be buildings, these may not be farm plots. There's not much evidence to suggest otherwise. If you look at where this carving is on the side of a valley, the geology which is below doesn't really match up to the kind of geology which we might claim to be represented in these maps. So the lesson here is, should we apply today's understanding of maps onto ancient forms of maps? And what does this mean to how we define a map today? So this brings us to these two key ideas. One's the cartographic ideal and one's the cartographic gaze. And so people refer to the cartographic ideal as something which sits in our minds, which convinces us that this must be a map or this must not be a map. So if we're all presented with an Ordnance Survey map, in our minds, we assume this is definitely a map. Whereas if we're presented with other kinds of spatial representation, like a rock carving, maybe this doesn't conform to the idea of the cartographic ideal. So scholars argue this is a kind of ideology that sits within our minds about what maps are and what they should do and perhaps what they shouldn't do. Alongside the cartographic ideal is this idea of the cartographic gaze, which is a way of seeing the world from the top down, as if that's the most objective way of seeing the world at all. So the important thing to remember about the cartographic gaze is it doesn't exist in a kind of natural sense. It was produced alongside the developments in technologies like aeronautical technologies, or even things like church towers, providing a different viewpoint for people to see the landscape below. So when we start understanding or thinking through, where did the cartographic ideal come from? Where did the cartographic gaze emerge from? This gets us away from the idea that that viewpoint is a natural viewpoint rather than, a socially produced, historically situated viewpoint. So one of the things that I've been trying to do in the book is differentiate cartography from mapping. So I would argue that cartography is a particular form of mapping. It's the science of map making, it's the standardization, the professionalization, and the institutionalization of map making. Whereas mapping, I would argue, is a far broader kind of culturally embedded way of representing spaces and places. So if we think about those rock carvings, I would argue they are forms of mapping, but they're not forms of cartography in the same sense that an ordnance survey map is a form of cartography. And if we trace the etymology of the word cartography, this becomes a bit more clear. So this word didn't really exist until the mid-19th century, where it emerged from France, actually. There was a big kind of hotbed center of cartographic production in France in the 19th century. And this is where we begin to see the emergence of this word come into being. Before this time, map was certainly used. Mapper was the kind of the common European way of talking about a map. But this idea that, producing maps could be a scientific endeavor or even a professional endeavor was something not yet established. And the same thing, alongside the rise of the word and the practice of cartography, the history of the cartographer themselves emerged during the same time. A very famous cartographer here is Nicolas Sanson in France, who became this kind of go-to cartographer for the kings, Louis VIII and Louis XIV. So from cartography, from the science of cartography, we get these conventions, and these should be conventions that you're all very familiar with if you've ever looked at a map, particularly a paper map. We'll certainly come to digital maps later. So I'm just going to go through a few of these to give you a sense of, where they came from, what they mean, and what they do to our understanding of what maps should be. So this is a series of mapping projections. So if you think about how the impossible task of representing a sphere to the Earth on a two-dimensional surface, this is when you need the role of the projection to do that work for you. So you need to find a way of using maths and geometry to flatten a sphere onto a two-dimensional surface. And there's been a series of projections produced over the years to give the most accurate or the most objective view of the world in its entirety. But the most famous of this is probably the Mercator projection in the bottom right-hand corner. There's another famous projection called the Peters projection, which some would argue is a more accurate kind of by area. But the Mercator projection is still the one that Google Maps use. It's still the one that is taught in schools. It kind of dominates our understanding about what the world should look like if we are thinking about it in terms of a map. So this should be, again, very familiar to you. But to give you a sense that, what we're seeing here is not necessarily an objective or an accurate view of the world, all we have to do is begin to look at, firstly, the position of the map. So this idea that the north should be at the top of the map, this isn't a natural thing. There's no reason why that should be at the top. It was a scientifically agreed upon standard, developed again during the 18th century, that the north should be at the top. If you look at older maps from throughout history, you'll see east at the top quite often, and in some cases south at the top in other examples. Other things to kind of keep an eye on here are the position of the countries in relation to the perspective of the viewer. So the reason why the Mercator projection centers Europe in the middle is because it was reflecting the map maker, who was making the map in Europe at the time, wanted to reflect the global significance of Europe during the kind of colonial era. I think it was the 1600s that it was produced originally. So the kind of the high point of Europeans' colonial power. If you go to Australia, you go to China, you go to America, you quite often see maps with those countries centered at the middle. And this gives you the sense that they are at the center of their worlds. So it's always interesting to look at maps as you travel around the world to see, where the perspective of that particular map. Then one final thing to look out for is land size. So very obvious examples here to show that this objectivity that we assume maps to have can always be questioned. So a very famous example of this is looking at Greenland in comparison to the continent of Africa. Africa is far larger than Greenland, and yet Greenland looks about equal size here. And there's a number of projects which have kind of dispelled the myth that this is the size or the true size of this nation. So if you look at this kind of insert here, you get the sense that actually, if you put Greenland in relation to the real size of Africa as a continent, it'd be more like the size of Algeria or Libya. So I would argue that, as I said earlier, cartography is part of mappings. It is a mapping, but it's certainly not the only way in which not the only way in which representations are used to kind of show us or give us a sense of our relationship to the Earth and various different places and processes within it. So I'd argue there are cartographic maps, there are performative maps. So if I tell you, a series of directions, that's a form of mapping. If I tell you a story of my childhood with certain locations, I would argue this is a form of mapping. There are other maps like cognitive maps. So if you go and get a black cab in London and you ask the taxi driver to go from A to B, they'll quite often talk about how they're using this cognitive map, this kind of cognitive understanding of the streets of London to make their way from A to B without using the paper map. And I really like this quote by Dennis Cosgrove here, which is that it allows for a broader approach to maps, or a broader scope for thinking about maps beyond just this kind of cartographic understanding that we have. So Dennis says that objects and practices that simplify the spatial complexities of the world can be classed as mapping. So I really like that as a way into this topic. And I'll just give you a few examples of what I mean now. So on the top left-hand corner, you've got a Micronesian stick and shell chart. So this looks nothing like an Ordnance Survey map. It doesn't really resemble the kind of ideas of maps that we have, particularly in the UK. But I would still argue it's a form of mapping. So what you're seeing here is a series of sticks and shells kind of bound together with twine. And what they represent are different islands, different swells in the ocean, different currents where different tides move across. And they're to be used a bit like a GPS, in situ. So you use them while you're on a boat, as an example of the boat on the right here, of where these kind of instruments are used. And while there's certainly ancient mappings, there is this tradition or this emergence of bringing back these traditions in some cases. And in the book, I talk at length about this particular, it's called the Polynesian Voyaging Society, trying to bring back this form of mapping, or experimenting with different forms of navigation and wayfinding compared to the GPS-based wayfinding that you find on most boats today. Another example of a mapping and not a cartography is in map artworks. So this is an artist I know called Gina Lee, and she did a project called Talking Map. And what she wanted to do with this project is use maps to tell stories of people that have migrated to London. And she was focused on Koreans that had migrated to New Malden in southwest London, a very famous kind of Korean town part of London. And she wanted to understand what was that experience of migrating to this city like, and what was it like of going to this kind of area famous for being a diaspora of this cultural group. And what she asked participants to do was, as she was interviewing them, was to jot down stories or to kind of write down key points which were important to those journeys and the places that they passed through, as well as the places they were going to. And she produced these, what she calls talking maps, and they're folded bits of paper. On the front, they usually have a kind of a sketch portrait of the person that she's speaking to. And on the inside, they have various different traces about the journeys that these women made. And then this final example is a project called Button Mapping by Amy Mulvena, who's a primary school teacher. And what she was doing here was asking, I think it was year 4, year 5 kids to map their local street using various different objects that she brought in. So in this case, buttons, shells, and matchsticks. And so what you're seeing is the street of one little girl's, a map of one little girl's street. But what's important here is that it's not cartographic. So there's nothing scientific about what's going on here. But it's interesting when you speak to Amy about why this map was produced. all these new relations begin to emerge. So if you look at the top left-hand corner, there's these two yellow shells together. So these represent, on the far left, the girl's house, and on the right, the girl's best friend's house. But in between, there's about 10 or 12 different houses. And the girl didn't care less about those houses. She was much more interested in just showing where she lived in relation to where her best friend lived. And the green button on the right, that represents the school. And the school is actually much closer to where they live than this map suggests. But having it far enough away was a way of kind of, distancing it in her mind from her home life and her best friend's house. Okay, so that was proposition number one, to get us thinking a bit more in a different way, perhaps, or approaching maps in a different way. And the book, in a few different ways, tries to take this argument forward by looking at various different technologies, different ways that people map, different reasons why people map. Now I want to talk about how people are using maps. And again, thinking about beyond just maps as practical tools to get us from A to B, or to show us information about what's happening where. And actually to begin to think about how do maps become part of social and cultural life worlds, like I call them. So how do they shape different social experiences, and how do different social experiences shape how we might use a map? So I'd argue in the book that maps are brought into social situations where they have an influence. I'm not arguing they have the only influence, but I argue there is an influence there to shape certain social practices. And we see this really clearly in practices of navigation. So, I'm sure many of you here have navigated using a map, whether it be a paper map or a digital map, or using GPS in your car. Now, I want to argue that these are not kind of two-dimensional activities where you put in your destination and you follow the route from A to B. I'm arguing that these are actually socially produced situations where the dynamics of the people that are around you, how you relate to those people, how they relate to you, all have an influence on how that map might be being used. I guess an obvious way of thinking about this is, if you've ever had an argument in the car about, which way to go, which way not to go, and the map is involved, I'm arguing that the map there has a kind of key element which is shaping that kind of relationship. And if you compare map reading with people that you know very well with map reading with people that you don't know very well, these are very different kinds of ways in which the map is being used. There are gender dimensions here too. So often, I did a series of tests when I was doing some fieldwork for this study, where I was putting people in the room together and asking them to plot a route from A to B. And it was amazing how quickly all the men in the room kind of made their claim to be expert navigators, whereas really in the end, it was many of the women that were the expert navigators, but didn't want to lay that claim publicly in front of everyone. So there's many studies now on thinking about the social life of navigation, but it's certainly something which isn't really taken, there's not much interest in it really in terms of schools of navigation or thinking about navigation as an activity. So this week is Ordnance Survey's National Map Reading Week. And it's all about how to build these skills of navigation for kids, for families, as well as getting outside. But I would argue it's also an opportunity to reflect upon, how is navigation with a map a social activity as well as a kind of geographical activity. Another way of thinking about this is, in a completely different context, is navigating in a rally car. So on the left here, you have pace notes. So if you're not familiar to rally car driving, which I wasn't before I started this book, pace notes are pieces of information which the co-driver puts together in recce's before the proper race. So the information here about surface conditions, whether turns are tight or whether turns are wide, how fast you can go around a turn, where are the straight bits, where are the bumpy bits, where are the big puddles, all these kinds of contextual information about the course is noted down in these pace notes. And when the driver and the co-driver are in the car, the co-driver's job is to read out these pace notes to the driver in a way which makes sense to the driver as they're driving forward. So again, I would argue that pace notes, they don't look anything like cartography, but they're a form of mapping in the sense that they are representing the spaces and places of interest on the rally driving course. What's also interesting about how this map is being used and how it's socially being used is that the relationship between the driver and the co-driver has to be almost symbiotic. They have to have a very close relationship to understand how each other talks, how each other reads notes, how they read the directions from the co-driver to the driver. And things like cadence become a really important part of this. So if you have a good cadence and the rally driver understands your cadence, you're more likely to understand what their notes are in relation to what you should be doing with your steering wheel and your gear stick. Okay, and again, a different context here, but the same kind of thing. So thinking about how maps become embedded in social worlds. So during the pandemic, we were all in lockdown at one stage or another. And maps became a very interesting interface for people to share experience with each other about what life in lockdown was like. And this is one project called Corona Diaries out of the US. And what you're seeing on this map here is a world map, and each of these numbers in these circles represent a number of different audio files. And if you zoom in, they look a bit like these red and orange pins here. If you click on one of these pins, there's a 2-minute audio clip with someone narrating what they're doing at that particular time, or how their day was in their house all alone. And what you've got collectively is this kind of collective experience of what was happening at the time. This idea that maps were a way into thinking about we're all in this together, rather than being kind of isolated individuals, in our own individual countries. There's quite a lot of different projects around the pandemic using maps as a kind of interface for sharing experiences. Another example of this is location sharing. So if anyone here is a parent of teenagers, this may be particularly pertinent. So location sharing has become a very popular practice. So this idea where you share your location with someone that you know, so they can keep an eye on where you are. So one example of this being used is if you're going to meet a bunch of friends, they can turn their location sharing on, and everyone can understand where everyone is in relation to the venue that they're going to, whether it be a pub or university or whatever. In certain social situations, there's an extra element there. So the reason why I brought up parents and teenagers is that this is has always been this kind of relationship to do with, where surveillance and care operate very closely together with each other. So parents want to care for their children by keeping an eye on them, and children want to know that they're being cared for, but they don't necessarily want to be, know that they're being kept an eye on. And location sharing creates a kind of new version of this thing that parents and teenagers have been doing for a long time now. I haven't actually spoken to any parents and teenagers about this, but it would be an interesting study to kind of figure out when and where location sharing is acceptable between a parent and a teenager, and where it's not, or where the boundaries are and how this works. Maybe someone in the Q&A has some experience of this. Okay, then finally in this section, I wanted to talk about producing maps themselves. So I'm not a cartographer, as you might have gleaned by now, but I'm interested in how and why people use maps, which includes how and why they make maps. So I spent a lot of time in humanitarian organizations looking at how they're using maps in a kind of crowdsourcing sense to produce maps for people in need of assistance. So there's been a growth in what's called mapathons or mapping parties over the last sort of 10, 15 years now, where organizations say there's just been this disaster, whether it be a natural disaster, a political disaster, and we need a bunch of people to produce maps for the humanitarian response to this. So if it's like a big flood or an earthquake, often lots of the roads and the buildings and the settlements change how they look. So these mapathons are getting people together to look at satellite imagery of before and after events, and they're producing maps based upon the changes in these differences in the imagery. So it's a very kind of altruistic practice where people come together to give their time rather than their money, as they maybe normally would do in charity circles. But they're also very social activities. So if you go to one of these things, often they're called mapping parties, often there's pizza and beer. And so it's a way of not only giving your time and your expertise for humanitarian causes, but also a way of indulging your social life or your social interests. So people make, very good friendship groups, and over time, there's kind of larger groups form. So it was interesting to observe this as well as being part of this. It isn't just that map making is done in a cold sense. It's very much done in a collective social sense. And often I found that people that knew each other well together and producing maps together, some of the conversations they would have together would end up on the map in some ways, so to speak. So if they were very interested in particular areas or particular features, these would be the things that would take prominence in the maps that they produce compared to other features which someone else may be more interested in doing. Okay. And then the final thing I want to talk about is how maps shape our perceptions and our politics. And like I said, some of these ideas may be a bit more familiar to you, but it's worth kind of reiterating and kind of developing them a bit further. So maps have long been known to shape our understanding of what is happening where. So if you turn on the news or you look in a newspaper, almost every day a map is being used in some way or another to show us what's happening where about a key event. And nowhere is this clearer than in maps of war, because war is a very complicated, complex operation on the ground, and you need to be able to convey that in a simple way or an effective way to a wider public. So maps have become almost the go-to interface for doing that alongside the narration and narratives by the reporters on the ground. So there's a long history of thinking about, how do certain maps represent war? How do they shape our perceptions and opinions of war? If you look at propaganda war maps, this becomes ever more clear. So this idea that maps are intentionally being used to convince us that certain sides are, advancing and other sides are retreating. And I think what's interesting here is how aspects like color are being used, how aspects like the sizing of different nations, the sizing of different armies is being represented and shown on the screen. Okay, another way of thinking about this is through how we understand geopolitics or how we perceive different geopolitical relationships around the world. And maps are a really good way of understanding not only what map makers think about those politics, but also the countries and the nations that host those map making organizations and those map making countries. So what you're seeing on the screen here is an OpenStreetMap map of China and Taiwan. So OpenStreetMap's policy is that all the languages must be to do with the host nation, which is why you're seeing it in Chinese and not in English. But what you're seeing here is a geographical representation of China on the left and Taiwan on the right. But you're also seeing a geopolitical perspective that Taiwan is not part of mainland China. If you go to a Chinese mapping company, particularly one owned and run by the Chinese state, you'll see that Taiwan isn't named as a separate country, it's named as a province, as a clear part of the bigger nation of China. Other areas of the world include places like Israel and Gaza at the moment, or Crimea and Ukraine. I think Crimea and Ukraine is a very interesting case. So when the invasion happened in 2022, all the big mapping companies, leapt out of their seats trying to figure out how they were going to represent Crimea in relation to Russia, in relation to Crimea, in relation to Ukraine. So I think if you go onto Google Maps today, it shows a dotted line between Crimea and Ukraine to show that this is a contested border rather than a region which belongs to each country. But if you go to a Russian mapping organization, mapping company, you'll see that Crimea is clearly a part of Russia, and they've kind of, they're showing their politics is quite clear to see on the screen. Then there's this kind of economic angle to think about. So, if you're a company like Google, you're not just producing maps for the fun of it, you're producing maps for, commercial purposes. So they're always trying to, develop new markets while also keeping certain politics in a neutral way. So if you look at areas like in northern India, around Kashmir, Pakistan and India, quite often this border changes what it looks like on the screen based upon particular, global geopolitics at the time. Okay. Okay, so places, this is quite a big topic. I think we could talk more about this in the Q&A. But how we perceive places is often done through the interface of a map or the surface of a map. So if you're going on holiday, often people turn to the map at some point or another to plan, the journey, or to plan things they want to go and see or visit. Or if you're just, trying to find a way across town, you may use, Google Maps to figure out what's going on in that place. What can you tell about that place from the map? And I think it's really interesting to think when you're Googling a place or using a map to find a place or to look through a place, what is that map showing you and what is it not showing you? So this is just one example I was working with today. This is a map of York showing churches and cathedrals around the city. Now, if you're interested in religious architecture and religion around the city more broadly, this gives you a very good view of where Christian and maybe Catholic churches and buildings are in the city. But if you're interested in religion and York more broadly, thinking about the wider religious landscape of the city, you're not really getting that from this map of these individual churches. For example, there's no location of a mosque, there's no location of a synagogue, for instance. So when we look at the iconography of a map, or the symbolism of a map, it's important to think about, or I argue it's important to think about, what is being shown there and whose views does that represent? What stories of the world is that telling us? Another good example of this that I show my students a lot of the time is looking at Google Maps at particular sites with particular cultural heritages. So for those of you that know Brixton in southeast London, this is an area which has a very strong Afro-Caribbean community and culture and has done since the Windrush. And if you go onto Google Maps and you type in Brixton, the first zoom layer of Brixton doesn't really tell you much about that at all. It gives you some streets, it gives you some hospitals and some bus stations and some tube stations. That's fine. But it takes you a number of different layers down before you get to, that kind of cultural heritage is revealed in any way whatsoever. Long before that, you're given symbolism of kind of corporate entities. So you see lots of McDonald's or H&M or other kind of big high street stores. And I think if you ask the people in Brixton what represents them, they're much more likely to say, these kind of cultural heritage aspects of the place rather than these kind of commercial aspects of the place. And yet it's not Google's job. They're not out there to kind of represent these cultural heritages. They're there to kind of show us where we can spend our money, because that's how they generate revenue. So again, it's thinking what is shown on the map and whose voices and whose views does that represent, and what is the reason for that. Okay, I'm going to finish up now, just a couple more slides. This is a image of GPS traces. So this is by an artist called Jeremy Wood, and he's using GPS devices to track his movements around London in this image. So for keen viewers, you may have noticed what's going on already. But in the kind of white squiggle in the middle, you've got central London. You can see the outline of the river if you look closely. And this is his walking routes mostly around the city. If you look a little bit further out, you can see the M25. So again, showing his kind of car journeys, I suppose. And if you look at the orange or yellow lines, these are representing flight paths. So on the left, you've got this dense kind of orange-yellow block. That's Heathrow Airport. And then the kind of large kind of ovals are the turning circles of when flights are, preparing to land or queuing to land to kind of enter Heathrow or to Gatwick. Anyway, the reason that Jeremy was doing this project was to kind of show how he himself was moving across the world and what that meant to him. Another good project that he did was called Mowing the Lawn, and he had a GPS device on every time he mowed the lawn throughout the year, and he produced these 4 maps of the different seasons, and you can see, where he was mowing the lawn, how often he was mowing the lawn based upon the season that he was in. So this is a project which may not have much interest beyond, his own personal interest, but it's beginning to show, the ways in which we can use maps now in a slightly different way than these kind of conventional ways that we might have thought about maps. So, for reflecting personal experiences, personal journeys, GPS devices now give us that possibility. Okay, then finally, when we're thinking about how maps shape politics and perception or understandings of geopolitics politics and perception, I think it would be amiss not to mention new developments in mapping technologies, which are all about mapping perceptions that have nothing to do directly with us. So these are images of a LiDAR system from a self-driving car. So the way that these work are that there's lots of sensors on the car, and the sensors are sending out light to objects, which are being reflected back up as objects to build up a picture of what is in front of it. And once a picture has been built up, again, I'd argue this is a mapping and maybe or maybe not form of cartography. Once the world is built up, the car is making decisions in real time on what to avoid or what it doesn't have to worry about. So if someone crosses the road, the car knows that this is the person, therefore it should stop or it should swerve out the way. But if it starts raining, the car can recognize this is just rain rather than anything that's going to impede its journey. So we're certainly moving into a world of maps being produced for non-human purposes directly. So you could argue here the cartography or the mapping is being done by the machine for the machine, even though it has a human use. I mean, we might start to see more of this if self-driving cars ever takes off in any great way. But it's worth mentioning here at the end to thinking about what's next for maps, what's next for how we think about maps in terms of perception and understanding of the world, because it's certainly not one of those topics or categories that's fixed in place. It's always kind of developing with the technologies which are emerging. Okay, so just to reiterate, and then it'd be great to get some Q&A from you. So I'd argue that maps are not always what they seem. So there's this kind of idea that we have that maps should be kind of fit to this cartographic ideal quite quickly falls apart when we think about other ways that people represent spaces and places, particularly outside of the kind of European Anglo-American context. There are many indigenous communities that I talk about in the book that use forms of mapping in a very different way, and yet for the same purposes. So still for navigation, but not in the same way that we produce maps for navigation. So I suggest that maps are always these kind of social and historically situated objects. They're not fixed in time, and there is no one-size-fits-all definition for a map, even if we might want one. If you go to a dictionary and look up the definition of a map, actually, it's quite a vague definition. There's often 4 or 5 different versions of what a map could be. And yet I think it's something that society at large assumes they know what it is. And I think that might come from particular educational backgrounds. Again, particularly in the UK, it's no coincidence that the Ordnance Survey map is the one which is still on the national curriculum. It's still taught at primary and secondary as the way to do navigation. Secondly, maps are social and cultural objects. So again, they are always embedded in social life, which shapes how they're used and also how they may be used in a different context. And finally, that maps shape our perceptions and our politics. So how we understand ourselves as well as the world around us is often shaped by our interactions with maps. I'm not saying that's the only consideration, of course, but it's certainly one part of the story which often isn't talked about in studies or works on maps. One of the reasons I made this book is that there are loads of books out there which show really beautiful maps, or 100 maps which change the world, or coffee table books which show the history of maps. But there's not really many books out there which show or think about why we use maps or what we might do with maps if we think about them in a slightly different way. And this is my attempt to do that with the book. So it's been a pleasure talking to you about the book. Thanks for listening. And there's copies available in the Fox Lane books. Thanks. I'll pass you back to Nick now.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. That was really fascinating. And I've read your book in the last week or so, and I think it was a really good distillation of all the really key points in it. So as you said, it'd be really great. We've got about maybe 15 minutes or so to go before the end. It'd be great if people could, if anyone who's been listening to your presentation has any questions, if you can put them in the Q&A. There's a little Q&A at the bottom of the presentation. So just put your questions in there and I will try and relate those through. So actually someone called Gwen has actually asked a question here. So I'll just say, do you have any observations about the importance of maps in creating imaginary worlds? So for example, Tolkien's worlds. So any thoughts on that, Mike?
Yeah, of course. Great question, Gwen. Thank you. Yes, they're often a way into literary worlds or fantasy worlds, and have been for a long time now. I guess there's two examples I can think of, and one you've already mentioned. Using Tolkien and the way that maps were used in the beginning opening of Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. These were certainly maps which I referred to when I was a kid as a way of following the story, following the kind of journey of the characters, as well as following the narrative. And this is a tradition which has only expanded since. There are many, many books now use this convention as a way of kind of building worlds for the reader. Another way of thinking about this is in film. So if you remember the Indiana Jones franchise, often maps are used here to build the world of the story. So that when he makes these massive journeys across the planet in a plane, often the underlay of that image is a map, again to evoke a certain imaginary of travel, of movement, of journeys. So yeah, thanks Gwen. That's a great question.
Yeah, and so Sarah has asked, how do you think maps or I suppose concepts like what three words will change the perceptions of mapping, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe for those that don't know, what three words is a grid system which does something slightly different than the coordinate system or the cartographic coordinate system. So it places, I think maybe Sarah, you have to correct me if I'm wrong, it places three unique words for every or triangulates three unique words so that every location has a unique identifier. And I think it's used or being tested in the emergency services as a way of identifying places that have these kind of idiosyncratic names. So if you live in a village and there's a corner that's famous for the person that lives on the corner called Bill, maybe that corner is called locally Bill's Corner, but on the Ordnance Survey map, it's called something else. And if someone has an accident at Bill's Corner and you're on 999, you don't know the actual name of the address, but you know it as Bill's Corner. I think what three words is trying to do is kind of build on that idea that you can have this colloquial understanding of place names, which offers a different version of these kind of more official place name systems. I think that's right, Sarah, but correct me if I'm wrong.
We've certainly used that actually, Mike, in terms of finding a specific tree that was actually a memorial tree for somebody, and actually that's actually a very, very good way of doing that. Another question, actually quite an interesting question, I think, is from someone called John, who said, "Do you think that paper maps will actually disappear eventually?"
Yeah, thanks, John. Definitely a question I get asked all the time. On the one hand, there's lots of evidence to suggest that paper maps are not going anywhere fast. So I think there's some statistics from recent years that actually paper map sales have increased both in the UK and the US. And this might be a hypothesis, reflects this desire or this need to get away from the digital. So, if you think about the last 20 years, there's an acceleration towards the adoption of digital mapping technologies, as well as other forms of digital technology. And there's been some resistance to that in the sense that people don't always want to be connected. They want to find other ways of engaging with the world that's not just via a screen or via a digital interface. So I would see it in the same kind of ballpark as the reason why vinyl records are increasing in sales, the reason why, the kind of same kind of idea, really, forms of resistance or difference to the digital world that we live in, or, the digital detox movement, there could be something there. The other interesting thing about this question is if you look around a city, you'll see that paper maps are everywhere, and in many ways they are in cities in more numbers than they ever have been before. One of the reasons for that is that cities are becoming more and more pedestrianised. So all pedestrianised zones now come with these kind of city maps, which you see. If you're handing out flyers or you're handed a flyer, look on the back of it, it'll probably show you a map of, a venue. In London is very famously done on the back of things like flyers for theatre venues or club venues. If you go onto transit systems, this is another way of seeing whether the paper map is still really prominent. So if you spend 5 minutes on Leicester Square Underground Station and look at the big maps on the wall, they're used all the time. People are still very interested in going to the map to figure out where they are, to trace routes with their fingers. It's very popular for tourists still, as well as for kind of locals debating on the best way to get from A to B. And often people find it much easier on that large scale than they would do kind of fiddling around on their phone, zooming in and out of the large scale tube map. On the tube itself, maps are still prominent at your eye line. So people are looking at maps all the time. And again, I think as well as, just looking at them in no focused way whatsoever, they're probably also being used there to plan routes, etc. So I would argue that paper maps are not going anywhere. They're just going to exist in a world which includes digital mapping technologies and analog maps. And I make the argument in the book that actually the ways in which we use maps is based upon context. So we always use the map which is most useful for us at that particular time. And so whether that be a digital map or a paper map doesn't really matter. If it makes more sense for us to use a paper map or digital map, then we just go for those options.
Yeah,
Thanks.
great answer, Mike. And perhaps a related question around sort of, somebody asked whether Google Maps limit our ability to read maps, as in we're now told to turn left or right, and there is that concept of it points you in the right direction, literally. So, and actually, it was a question I was thinking of. Actually, was around that sort of, do you think it's limiting the way in which we actually think for ourselves, I suppose, when trying to navigate?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think again one that's been covered quite a bit in recent over the last decade or so. So it's certainly true that we approach a map in a different way when we use a Google map. So we don't have to locate ourselves on the map first in order to use the map. We just click, the location pin, and it locates us for ourselves. Now, some people argue that's a loss of navigational skill. Some people would argue that's just a different way in which we use maps. I'm not sure if where I stand on that, actually, because if you accompany people using a digital map, they're doing far more than just looking at the map to navigate. So if you follow someone through a busy city or the countryside, they're not just looking at the map and then at the landscape back at the map. They're looking at things in the landscape, which are waypoints or sites of significance. So in a city, it could be what's on the front of a bus, landmarks in the distance, famous streets that they know, where the crossings on roads are. So there's not necessarily this direct correlation between the map and where you want to go or how good you are at getting to where you want to go. I think it's a bit more messy than that. And I think this is something which sorry, I've forgotten. Neuroscientists are beginning to think about too. So it's not just whether you're a good navigator or not because you can remember routes or you have a good sense of direction, but it's much more to do with a kind of contextual awareness of where you are.
Yeah, I think, you talk in your book, I think, about giving different groups of people the same sort of route and just observing how they go about it, looking at different landmarks and stopping and getting a coffee and things like that. So, again, a slightly related question. Someone's asked, or Jack has asked about whether, sort of whether maps change the perception of how we move through the world, in the sense of whether, for example, if we know that it's going to take us 45 minutes to walk somewhere, we might just think, actually, forget that. Whereas if you just think it's over there, you might just go for it, I guess, is the question. Do you think that affects things, do you think?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess it depends again on what you're doing. So I always, if you've ever, flown and look at the map on the back of the seat that shows you how long you've got left, often that map scenes, it makes it seem even longer, right? Especially if you're on a long haul flight. In some cases, the map is not helpful for telling you where you are because it's not actually telling you, it's not getting there any closer. In some cases, just a countdown timer might be a more suitable interface. But it's certainly, if you think about driving, a different example, it's definitely changed the way that people think about themselves in relation to where they want to go. It's much more time-based now. So the time feature and the map feature together is often what people talk about. They're not necessarily interested in the route they're taking, as long as it's the quickest route from A to B. And that I think that is a fundamental change, actually, in terms of how people use maps in the car. That's certainly how I do it. It's not necessarily about taking the scenic route. It's about which route does Google show me to be the quickest.
Yeah, I think that's probably true for a lot of people, isn't it? Someone's asked something about social gaming, and I must admit I don't know much about this. I don't know whether you do.
Yeah, that's a great question, Tom. Thanks. So yeah, I did a bit of work with social gamers, Pokemon Go users, as well as geocachers. So these are people that use maps as part of a kind of social game, usually outside, usually together. So Pokemon Go famously uses a map on your phone where you go to a location where these virtual Pokemon are, and you tick them off your list, or you battle each other, sorry, other people with them. But the map is this kind of primary interface for finding the Pokemon. And I did argue strongly earlier in my career on this, thinking about how do maps build social bonds? And often you find that the map again plays a central role between people. If you're able to share, knowledge, experience, understanding of how the map is used, this builds a relationship with another person. It's difficult. It's quite easy to fall into the trap of maps are the things which equal good relationships. I'm not trying to argue that, but I'm trying to say let's just give a bit more prominence to the map in these kinds of social situations.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. The there's another question about sort of systems, and I guess this sort of relates to the autonomy of finding of different organizations actually being able to build their own maps, I suppose. And the question seems to be around, is there any standardization of approaches in terms of different technologies? I mean, I guess that's sort of thinking about the homogenization perhaps of approaches, but I mean, I sense from your book there's possibly things like the concept of counter mapping actually sort of gives perhaps an alternative narrative to the traditional sort of here's the best route to go. Actually, some people are now developing their own map. So I wonder. I mean, the question is around: do you think there's standardization, but actually possibly there's a counter argument to that? I think.
Yes, yeah, that's a good point, Nick. Yeah, so there's certainly standardization, and maybe it's not that it's new standardization. It's just there's just more of it, or there's the frequency in which standardization changed, maybe happening more now. So if you think about scales, one form of standardization, 1 to 25,000 maps, 1 to 50,000 maps, 1 to 40,000 maps. These have been standard scales of mapping for a long time now. Whereas new standards of scale, particularly to do with 3D modeling or autonomous vehicles, as you mentioned, every company is using new forms of standardization as almost intellectual property. They want to own the form of standardization, and they want to keep it as commercially private property, so they don't have to give it to their competitors. So it's always worth thinking about new advances in technology in relation to the kind of the economics of it. Why are they doing these things? And then to your point, Nick, around countering that. So while there has been this drive towards standardization and more of it, there's also been a move away from standardization as a way of distancing yourself from this form of map making. So counter mapping is this kind of catch-all term referring to producing maps that don't conform to standard cartographic conventions or don't represent the dominant worldviews of most national or commercial mapping agencies. So you have lots of marginalized communities around the world using counter maps to show what the world is like for them, or to raise particular issues which are pressing to them at that particular time. To give you one example of that, in land disputes around the world, counter maps are often used by local communities to show the impacts of, excuse me, the impacts of something like a new mining development or a new plantation development. And often these impacts are hidden in official documentation, but counter mapping is used by local communities to kind of get those things to light, which they can then maybe influence policy or contribute towards a kind of legal case against these things. So they are kind of using non-standardized versions of maps to challenge maybe standardized versions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. Thank you. I think we're almost out of time, Mike, and I think we got through quite a lot of questions. So thanks to everyone for asking the questions, and sorry if we didn't quite get to all of them, but thank you for trying to answer so many, Mike. So I just wanted to just finish by saying thank you so much for giving up your time to come and talk about that. It was really fascinating, and I certainly, even having read the book, it certainly added more to it, and I thought it was really interesting. So just a reminder for everyone that this is the event has been recorded, and it'll be available from the Festival of Ideas YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival. and you'll be contacted by email when the video is available to view. Mike mentioned that his book is available from our partner bookseller, Foxlane Books, foxlanebooks.co.uk. And I think that is it. So thank you very much, Mike.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks everyone for coming.